The Bench by the River. Chapter 1. The Bench. The mornings belonged to Harold Jensen. At 72, he had no use for alarm clocks or hurried breakfasts. He rose when the light filtered through the curtains of his little house on River Street, brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and filled his old green thermos. He always added 1 sugar cube, no more, no less, because that's how Linda used to take hers. And after 44 years of marriage, habits had a way of sticking even after the person was gone. By 8 o'clock, Harold was usually making his way down the cracked sidewalk toward the park. The air smelled of damp earth and cut grass, and the river gave off a steady hush, like the world's longest sigh. The bench under the cottonwood tree waited for him as it always did, gray, weathered, a little lopsided on one leg. Nobody else seemed to favor it, which suited him fine. He lowered himself onto the seat with the care of a man who had learned the difference between moving quickly and moving wisely. From here, he could watch the Mississippi roll past, carrying with it barges stacked with grain and the occasional boat painted in cheerful reds and whites. Ducks squabbled in the reeds, and a heron sometimes strutted along the opposite bank like it owned the place. Harold poured coffee into the lid of the thermos and let the steam rise against his face. He liked to sip slow and let his mind wander. Sometimes he thought about the years he spent teaching history at Prairie Falls High School. Rows of half-asleep juniors, the clatter of chalk against the blackboard, the joy of explaining Lincoln's words until they finally lit up in a student's eyes. Other times he thought about Linda, her laugh, her patience, the way she made pot roast on Sundays and pretended it wasn't the same recipe from the church cookbook everyone else used. But more often than not, when he sat on this bench, Harold thought of Margaret. It surprised him still. He hadn't courted her, hadn't kissed her, hadn't shared more than a handful of polite conversations over the decades. And yet she lived in his memory as clearly as if they'd walked hand in hand down River Street every day of their youth. She had belonged to another man, and then to the years themselves, while Harold had built a life with Linda. But unchosen love has a stubborn way of hanging on, like a tune you never quite forget. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. 72 years old, he muttered, and still mooning over the one that got away. Foolish as a schoolboy. A jogger puffed past, earbuds in, too focused to return his wave. Harold didn't mind. He leaned back, letting the bench creak under his weight, and sipped again. The river was steady, dependable. Life less so. Today he was wondering, not for the first time, what a man was supposed to do when most of the major chapters of his life had already been written. Teaching, raising kids, mowing the same lawn for decades, even saying goodbye to his wife. All of that had been lived. What was left? The cottonwood leaves stirred above him, whispering in the wind like they knew the answer. Harold waited, listening. Somewhere, downriver, a barge horn sounded, deep and lonely. He thought of Margaret again, of the red scarf she'd worn the day he first saw her. Funny how memory worked. Certain details burned bright, while whole years blurred into a fog. Harold rubbed his thumb along the rim of the coffee lid. Maybe it wasn't too late to do something different, even now. Maybe there were still pages left to fill. For the moment, though, he stayed on the bench, drinking slowly, watching the river carry everything forward. Chapter 2. The Church Supper. The trouble with church suppers was that you never quite knew what you'd be eating. On good nights, the long tables in the basement of First Lutheran were covered with fried chicken crisp enough to crunch between your teeth, green beans cooked with bacon, and pies, blueberry, apple, rhubarb, lined up like soldiers on duty. On less fortunate nights, you risked Jell-O salads with unidentifiable fruit or a casserole that looked like it had been invented in haste and regret. Still, Harold went. Not because he loved potluck mysteries, but because sitting in his kitchen alone night after night had begun to wear on him. The church basement was crowded and noisy, the smell of coffee strong enough to curl his nose hairs. Folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor, and the women from the quilting circle bustled about with aprons tied snug at their waists. Pastor Dean, bless him, tried to keep things organized, but once folks got in line, it was every man for himself. Harold Jensen, someone called from the dessert table. Haven't seen you in a while. He turned and found himself face to face with Margaret. For a moment, he almost didn't recognize her. Her hair, once dark, was silver now, cut neatly just above her shoulders. She wore a navy sweater with a brooch shaped like a sunflower pinned at the collar. The years had left their marks, wrinkles, softer edges, but her eyes were the same. Warm, steady. Well, I'll be, Harold said, his voice catching in his throat. Margaret, she smiled, and it was like being 22 again, standing in his uncle's feed store watching a girl in a red scarf write out a shopping list. Would you like mashed potatoes? She asked, holding a serving spoon like it was part of her. He chuckled. That depends. Are they real or powdered? Real, she said, laughing. I made them myself. Don't tell me you can't trust me after all these years. Well, in that case, give me an extra scoop. You always did have a good hand in the kitchen. She served him, and for a moment, their eyes met a little longer than politeness required. He carried his plate down the line, picking up a piece of fried chicken and some carrots, but his mind wasn't on the food. Later, when he sat down at one of the long tables, Margaret found the seat across from him. He could hardly believe it. After all those decades of polite hellos and goodbyes, here they were with plates of chicken and potatoes between them. So, she said, folding her napkin. How have you been, Harold? I heard about Linda. I'm very sorry. Thank you, he said quietly. 44 years. Hard to believe she's gone. Margaret nodded. Frank's been gone 7 now. It doesn't get easier, not exactly. But it changes. You learn to live with the empty chair at the table. He studied her face. There was no pretense in her tone, only understanding. Somehow, that comforted him more than all the casseroles the church ladies had brought by after Linda's funeral. They talked through the meal. About aches and pains. My knees sound like popcorn in a skillet, Harold admitted. About children and grandchildren. About how the town had changed. New gas station. High school football team not as strong as it used to be. At one point, Margaret laughed so hard at one of his stories about teaching 9th graders that she had to dab her eyes with a napkin. You always could tell a story, Harold, she said. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Light. Not giddy, not foolish, just a kind of ease that came from being seen, from being known by someone who remembered him as more than just that old widower on River Street. When the supper ended and folks began folding chairs and clearing tables, Margaret touched his hand lightly. It was good talking to you, she said. Maybe we'll do it again. Harold nodded, though his heart was thudding like he was a teenager caught skipping school. Yes, he said. I'd like that. Walking home that night, the stars high above the quiet streets, Harold carried a warm feeling inside him. Not the sharp ache of longing he remembered from youth, but something gentler. Something that felt, if not like hope, then at least like possibility. And for a man his age, that was no small thing. Chapter 3, The Library Tutor. The public library still smelled the same as it had when Harold first walked his children through its doors 40 years ago. A mix of old paper, carpet shampoo, and the faint sweetness of crayons from the children's section. He hadn't set foot inside much since retirement. Truth be told, he'd spent enough years with stacks of history textbooks that he didn't always crave more reading. But when his daughter, Ellen, mentioned that the library was looking for volunteers to help with the after-school program, Harold found himself saying yes before he thought too hard about it. Dad, you've got patience, she'd said over the phone. Those kids need someone who won't give up on them. You'd be perfect. And so, on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, Harold found himself sitting at a long table in the children's room, surrounded by pencil boxes, math worksheets, and the hum of restless energy. Mr. Jensen, this is Caleb, said the young librarian, a cheerful woman with glasses and a cardigan covered in cat pins. He's in 4th grade, and needs a little extra help with reading. Caleb was a wiry boy with hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in a week. He slouched in the chair and muttered, "Hi," without looking up. "Howdy," Harold said. He set his thermos of coffee on the table and leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "You know, I used to be terrible at reading when I was your age." That got Caleb's attention. "You?" "Oh yes," Harold nodded solemnly. "I read so slow my teacher thought I was napping. Took me a whole month to get through Charlotte's Web. And let me tell you, those pigs don't get any thinner while you're taking your time." Caleb snorted, trying to hide a smile. "Tell you what," Harold said. "Why don't you read me a page? And if you get stuck, I'll help. Then I'll read you a page, and you can see how slow I was back in the day." "Deal." The boy considered, then shrugged. "Deal." They worked through 2 chapters of a book about a baseball player who wanted to be a pitcher. Caleb stumbled over words like championship and curveball, but by the 3rd time he read them, he got it right. When Harold read his own page in an exaggerated drawl, tripping on easy words just to get a laugh, Caleb cracked up so hard the librarian had to shush them. By the time Caleb's mother arrived, Harold realized an hour had passed without him once thinking about the empty house waiting at home. "Thanks, Mr. Jensen," Caleb said, hoisting his backpack. "You're not as boring as my teacher." "High praise," Harold said with a grin. The librarian stopped by as Harold packed his things. "He doesn't usually warm up to people that quickly," she whispered. "You've got a gift." Harold waved her off, embarrassed. "Just an old teacher trick. You give kids a little rope, and they'll climb higher than you expect." But as he walked home through the crisp evening air, Harold felt lighter, the way he had after the church supper with Margaret. Teaching again, even in this small, unofficial way, had woken something in him he hadn't realized was sleeping. The house was still quiet when he unlocked the door, still filled with shadows where Linda's presence used to be. But instead of letting the silence settle heavy, he brewed another cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, jotting a note on the back of an envelope. "Tuesday afternoons, library." He left it there, in his shaky handwriting, as if to remind himself there were still things to do, still people who needed him. Life wasn't over yet. Chapter 4, The Red Scarf. Memory was a funny thing. It could let whole decades slip into a blur, but sharpen one single afternoon until it felt like yesterday. For Harold, that afternoon was the fall of 1968, the day he saw Margaret Price walk into his uncle's feed store. He had just come back from the army that summer, thin from too many months overseas, restless in a way he couldn't put into words. Prairie Falls, Iowa, looked much the same as when he'd left. The grain silos stood against the sky. The water tower still carried the high school's proud red and white mascot, and Main Street had the same 3 bars, 2 diners, and 1 movie theater. But Harold wasn't the same. He was 22, with calloused hands, a duffel bag still half-packed in his bedroom, and a sense that he didn't quite fit into the life waiting for him. So he worked at his Uncle Carl's store while he figured out what came next. Most days were slow, bags of seed hauled out to pickups, sacks of feed stacked on pallets, the radio crackling with farm reports. And then she walked in. She wore a red scarf tied around her hair, the ends tucked neatly under her chin. Her father came with her, carrying a list written on a folded slip of paper. Margaret held the pencil, checking things off as they went down the aisles. Cracked corn, mineral blocks, a sack of flour. She was not the kind of girl to waste words, but when her father turned to ask Harold about a price, she looked up and smiled. That smile undid him. Later, he could never remember what she'd bought or what he'd said, but he remembered that smile like a flash of sunlight across the counter. He remembered the way her eyes held his for just a second longer than manners required. When she left, scarf tails fluttering as the door swung shut behind her, Harold found himself gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles turned white. "You all right, boy?" Uncle Carl asked, looking at him over his wire-rimmed glasses. "Fine," Harold muttered, though his chest was pounding like he'd just run wind sprints. That night, He drove out along a gravel road, parking his old Chevy under a cottonwood tree. He let the radio hum low and stared out at the stubbled cornfields, wide and empty under the October sky. He told himself not to be foolish, that she was just a girl from town, nothing more. But in the quiet, with the stars wheeling above him, he let himself imagine a life that might include her. Sunday picnics, shared cups of coffee, a porch light waiting for him at the end of the day. It was nothing but a dream. And yet it was a dream that stayed, even after Margaret's engagement was announced in the Prairie Falls Gazette the next spring. Harold had shaken her fiancé's hand at the town picnic, smiling the way a man is expected to smile, and then driven home alone, the fireworks that night sounding more like gunfire than celebration. He went on, of course. He kept working, kept showing up for church, even took night classes at the community college. He told himself Margaret was just a passing fancy, a what-if that would fade with time. But some things don't fade. Some things lodge in a man's heart like a seed, growing quietly even when the soil of his life is busy with other roots. And for Harold Jensen, that seed was planted the day a girl in a red scarf smiled at him in a feed store in 1968. Chapter 5, Echoes. The morning after the church supper, Harold sat at his kitchen table, staring at his coffee as if it might explain something to him. It wasn't the first time he'd thought of Margaret in the years since Linda's passing, but this time was different. Last night, they hadn't just exchanged polite pleasantries over a stack of hymnals or in the frozen foods aisle. They had sat together, laughed together, shared the kind of quiet understanding only two people who had lost their spouses could share. And that red scarf memory, buried under years of teaching, raising children, and mowing lawns, had come rushing back to him with startling clarity. He rubbed his hands over his face and let out a sigh. "Lord help me," he muttered. "I'm too old to be acting like some boy at a barn dance." Yet, as he rose and put on his jacket to head down toward the river, Harold couldn't shake it. Seeing Margaret again had stirred something long dormant, like embers flaring when you thought the fire was out. At the bench, the river was running high from spring melt. The air was damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and fresh growth. Harold poured coffee into the thermos lid and watched a barge push upriver, slow and steady. He remembered the night in 1969 when he'd read the engagement announcement in the Prairie Falls Gazette. He remembered how he'd driven out past the town limits, headlights carving a lonely path through the fields, wondering if he'd missed his one chance at happiness. But that wasn't the truth, not really. Linda had come into his life soon after, and with her, a love that had been steadfast, deep, and good. He never doubted that. Linda had been his partner, his anchor, his home. Still, unrequited love had its own kind of permanence. It left a mark, not sharper than grief, but different. A ghost of a door never opened. Harold sipped his coffee. He thought of Margaret ladling mashed potatoes, laughing until tears came to her eyes, her hand brushing his as they cleared their plates. She hadn't meant anything by it. He knew that. She was friendly, gracious, the way she'd always been. And yet, he shook his head and chuckled. "What are you thinking, Harold?" he muttered. "She's not the answer. She never was." But the truth was, seeing her again had awakened questions he didn't know he still carried. Questions about what it meant to be alone now, about whether companionship was still possible, about whether the next chapter of his life was supposed to be written in solitude or shared somehow. He stayed on the bench longer than usual, watching the river move, patient and unstoppable. By the time he rose to walk home, Harold had decided at least one thing. He wouldn't rush it. Whatever came, whether it was more evenings at church suppers, afternoons at the library, or simply tending the community garden when spring came in earnest, he would let it come in its own time. The river taught him that much. Things moved forward, steady as the current, whether a man hurried them or not. Chapter 6, Linda. It was the spring of 1970, a year after Margaret's wedding, when Harold first noticed Linda Miller. She wasn't flashy. No red scars or show-stopping smiles that made the world tilt, at least not at first. Linda was quiet. With brown hair she wore in a loose braid and a way of looking at people that made them feel she actually saw them, not just the surface. Harold met her at the county fair, of all places. He was helping his uncle run a booth selling seed corn and mineral supplements for livestock. Linda had come with her younger sister, who was determined to win a ribbon for her prize heifer. The first thing Harold noticed was that Linda laughed at her sister's nervous chatter, not in a mean way, but in a warm, calming way. When her eyes landed on Harold, she offered a small smile, polite but genuine. "You work for Harold Jensen, don't you?" she asked, her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am," Harold said, standing straighter than the situation demanded. "And you must be a miller. Everybody in this town's either a miller or married to one." She laughed, not the quick burst of Margaret's laugh, but a gentle ripple that settled into him just the same. They talked a little while her sister fussed over the heifer. About the fair, about the dry summer, about the high school baseball team Harold had once played for. Nothing earth-shaking. But when Linda left, Harold found himself replaying her words in his head, as though each one carried a weight worth keeping. He asked her to the church picnic 2 weeks later. She brought a lemon cake with frosting that was a little uneven but tasted like sunshine. They ate fried chicken on paper plates and sat side by side under the shade of a maple tree, watching kids toss horseshoes. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't a thunderclap. It was steadier than that, like the slow filling of a well, clear and sure. By autumn, Harold couldn't imagine his days without her. She had a way of listening that made his scattered thoughts come together, and a quiet determination that kept him from drifting too far into his own restless moods. Where Margaret had been a spark of light, Linda was a steady flame. Years later, when their children were grown, Harold would sometimes tease her about that first picnic. "You brought a crooked cake," he'd say, shaking his head. "And you ate half of it," Linda would answer, smiling. "So I guess it wasn't too crooked." The memory of her laugh still warmed him now, decades later, as he sat in his quiet kitchen. He could almost hear her moving through the house, the soft hum as she folded laundry, the clink of dishes as she washed them, the low murmur of her voice when she read aloud to the children. Harold loved her. He had always loved her. Whatever shadows Margaret cast on his heart, Linda had been the one who built a life with him, brick by brick, year after year. And that, he knew, was a blessing greater than any fleeting dream. Chapter 7. The Garden Plot. The lot behind the Methodist church had been an eyesore for years. Once, it held a hardware store, but after the owner passed on and the building was torn down, nothing replaced it but weeds and gravel. Now, a hand-painted sign nailed to a post read, "Community Garden, plots available. Inquire with church office." Harold stood there on a Saturday morning in April, hands in his jacket pockets, staring at the rectangle of dirt that had been tilled into neat rows. A few others were already at work, an older woman in a sun hat planting marigolds, a young father showing his boy how to press bean seeds into the ground, a pair of teenagers arguing over which row should get the tomatoes. It smelled like spring, damp soil, new grass, a hint of fertilizer. "Thinking about taking a plot, Harold?" Pastor Dean called, walking over with his easy stride. Harold shrugged. "I haven't gardened much since Linda passed. She was the green thumb, not me. I mostly hauled the bags of mulch." Dean chuckled. "Well, hauling mulch is half the battle, and we've got plenty to go around. Come on, take a row. You'll be surprised how it grows on you." So Harold signed his name on the clipboard and was handed a narrow strip of dirt about 20 feet long. Standing there with the small stake bearing his name, Jensen scrawled in permanent marker. He felt a little foolish, like a boy signing up for the school play. But there was also something hopeful in it. That afternoon, he stopped by the feed store, still run by his cousin's son, and bought packets of seeds, tomatoes, green beans, cucumbers, and on impulse, sunflowers. Linda had always loved sunflowers. She said they looked like God had dropped a little bit of sunshine into the soil just for the fun of it. Planting was slow work. His knees ached when he knelt, and getting up again took some maneuvering. But there was a quiet satisfaction in pushing each seed into the earth, patting it over, and trusting the rest to time and weather. As he worked, memories came unbidden. Linda bent over their backyard garden, her braids slipping over her shoulder as she weeded. The way she'd wipe her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt that made her laugh when he pointed it out. The way she'd line up jars of home-canned pickles on the kitchen counter like trophies. When he straightened up at last, the row looked small, almost comical compared to the wide field across town. But it was his row, his start. "Looks good, Harold," said the woman in the sun hat as she passed by with a watering can. "Give it time. You'll be surprised what comes up." "Hope so," Harold said, brushing dirt from his palms. Walking home later, he felt tired, but not in the empty way he usually did after a long day. His hands smelled of soil, his back ached, but his heart was lighter. He thought of the children who would run between the rows in summer, of neighbors trading zucchini and recipes, of maybe even Margaret stopping by to pick up a tomato or two. Mostly, though, he thought of Linda. She would have been proud of him, out there with his knees in the dirt, making something grow again. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his thermos lid full of coffee, looking out the window toward where the stars flickered over the river. For the first time in years, he felt the tug of a new rhythm, something to tend, something to look forward to, something alive. The garden would grow, he thought, and maybe, just maybe, so would he. Chapter 8. Sunlight Through Leaves. Harold was kneeling in his row of beans, trowel in hand, when he heard the soft crunch of shoes on the gravel path behind the garden. He looked up, squinting against the morning sun, and saw Margaret standing there, hands tucked into the pockets of her navy cardigan. "Well, hello there," she said, her voice gentle but carrying that same warmth he remembered from decades ago. "I heard you were starting a little project back here. Thought I'd see it for myself." "Margaret," Harold said, rising slowly and brushing dirt off his hands. "I wasn't expecting, well, anyone to stop by just yet." She smiled, tilting her head as if she could see more than the rows of freshly planted vegetables. "I've been meaning to. I'm glad I did." He gestured toward the narrow rows of green, just breaking the soil. "Nothing fancy, just trying to make something grow again." Margaret nodded. "It looks good. You've got ambition in those beans, that's for sure." They walked together between the rows, Harold explaining where he'd planted the tomatoes, the sunflowers, the cucumbers. Margaret listened quietly, asking the occasional question about seeds, sunlight, or how often he planned to water. He found that even these small conversations, ordinary on their surface, carried a quiet intimacy. No flirtation, no expectation, just companionship, the kind built over years of knowing someone in small ways that mattered. "You always had a knack for patience," she said finally, resting a hand on a rake she'd picked up from the shed. "Even back when we were kids. I remember watching you help your little sister with her schoolwork. She must have hated every minute, but you stuck with her." Harold chuckled, the sound low in his chest. "I guess I did. I've always liked seeing things take shape, even if it's not exactly what I imagined at first." She looked at him with a quiet seriousness. "I think that's a good trait to have, especially at our age. Makes you steady somehow." He smiled. Steady. That was a word he hadn't thought about in a long time. Not steady like a river, not unshakable, but steady enough to keep going, day by day, row by row. For a moment, they stood together, watching the soil and seeds, listening to the breeze rustle through the trees. No words were necessary, not yet. There was a comfort in simply being present with someone who understood the small triumphs and quiet losses of life. "I'll check back soon," Margaret said, finally, turning toward the path out of the garden. "Maybe I'll bring my granddaughter next time. She loves helping in gardens." Harold nodded. "I'd like that. We'll have a little sunflowers row just for her." As she walked away, Harold felt a gentle lift in his chest, not the sharp pang of unrequited longing from decades past, but something quieter, something that felt like hope tempered with wisdom. He returned to his row of beans, digging carefully, planting with attention, feeling as though each seed carried not just a vegetable, but a little piece of life, memory, friendship, and the patient work of building something meaningful. And for the first time in years, he felt that maybe the future didn't have to be something he faced alone. Chapter 9: Rows of Laughter. By late May, the community garden was no longer just Harold's little project. It had become a patchwork of neighbors, children, and curiosity seekers. Harold arrived one Saturday morning to find the place humming with life. Sunflowers already peaked above the fence line. Tomato seedlings leaned toward the sun, and a trio of neighborhood kids were arguing over who got to water the cucumbers first. Now, Harold called, squatting down to eye level with them. Watering is not a competition. The cucumbers don't care who's faster. They just want to drink. They grow faster if you cheer for them, one of the boys insisted, giggling. Ah, Harold said, pretending to be thoughtful. I'll allow cheering, but only polite cheering. Nearby, Mrs. Klein, the older woman in the sun hat, was busy digging a row of carrots while humming an old hymn. A teenage boy named Sam was attempting to plant zucchini in a haphazard zigzag, and Harold gently corrected him, letting the boy know planting straight rows didn't have to be boring. Through it all, Margaret appeared at the gate, her granddaughter in tow. "Good morning," she called, brushing dirt off her hands. "We brought gloves." She's very serious about her sunflowers. "Perfect timing," Harold said, smiling. He handed the girl a small trowel. "This row here? All yours. Sunflowers for everyone to admire." The granddaughter, a bright-eyed girl with pigtails, grinned and ran to her spot, digging carefully as Harold guided her hand at first. Margaret lingered, leaning against the fence, watching him move among the kids with ease, explaining, showing, laughing. "You've got away with this," she said quietly, once the girl was fully engaged. Harold paused, wiping his brow. "I suppose I do. It's like teaching. Only the students grow a little differently." Margaret laughed softly. "And the curriculum's more forgiving, I suppose." They worked side by side for a while, planting beans and tomatoes, exchanging stories about summers past. There was no pressure, no expectation, just shared effort, sunlight through the leaves, the murmur of children and neighbors blending with the gentle hum of the town. At one point, a rogue watering can tipped over, spilling water across 2 rows of seedlings. Harold and a few kids ran to rescue the little plants, laughing as if the mishap had been planned. Margaret joined in, gently helping to scoop dirt over the wet roots, and Harold felt the warmth of connection, quiet and steady. By late afternoon, the garden was alive in a way that made Harold's chest ache a little, with pride, with gratitude, with the simple joy of community. Margaret's presence added a layer he hadn't expected, a companionable rhythm, easy conversation, a reminder that life's threads can weave together in unexpected ways. As the sun began to lower behind the cottonwood trees lining the river, Harold leaned on his rake, surveying the patchwork of green, yellow, and brown. Children ran through the rows. Mrs. Klein hummed still, and Margaret stood near the gate, watching the little chaos with a gentle smile. He realized, then, that the garden had become more than soil and seeds. It was a place to give, a place to nurture, a place to laugh, and maybe, if he allowed himself, a place to quietly reconnect with old feelings without letting them control him. Harold tipped his hat to Margaret. "Looks like we did good work today," he said. "We did," she agreed. "And tomorrow, we'll do it again." He smiled, watching the sunflowers sway in the evening breeze. For the first time in decades, Harold Jensen felt a steady kind of happiness, rooted, patient, and bright as the summer sunflowers lining the fence. Chapter 10: The Quiet Currents. That night, Harold sat on his porch, The garden behind him bathed in moonlight. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of soil and sunflowers, and the soft hum of crickets filled the gaps between memories. He held his coffee in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his knuckles, letting the world slow down to the rhythm of his breath. He thought of Margaret, not the girl in the red scarf anymore, nor even the woman he'd shared a polite supper with recently, but the quiet presence she had become, a reminder of possibility, of life's small, persistent spark. He smiled softly, shaking his head. He had loved her once, or maybe what he had felt was the idea of her, a light he chased in the corridors of his youth. That love had never been returned in the way he might have wished, but perhaps it hadn't needed to be. It had shaped him, taught him patience, taught him longing without bitterness. And then there was Linda. How could he measure her against anything else? She had been the life he lived, the heart of his home, the steady flame beside him for decades. Loving her had been simple in the hardest ways, supporting, listening, sharing, forgiving, laughing, and building a life out of ordinary days. That love had endured, and it had been returned with every glance, every word, every small gesture that had become the texture of his life. Harold leaned back in his chair and let his eyes drift to the garden. The sunflowers leaned toward the west, bending as if to catch the last light of day. Beans, cucumbers, tomatoes, they would all grow, as they always did, whether he fretted over them or not. And perhaps that was the lesson he was meant to take to heart. Growth, like love, is patient. Growth, like the river, moves forward whether you hold on too tightly or let it flow. He remembered telling a student once, decades ago, that life was a lot like history. You couldn't change the past, you could only learn from it and carry its lessons forward. Now, as he sat in the quiet, he realized the truth of it applied to the heart as well. Some loves teach you about loss, some about joy, and some about the courage to keep giving even when the outcome is unknown. Margaret's presence in his life now wasn't about rekindling old flames. It was about connection, about sharing afternoons with someone who understood, about letting a new chapter unfold without erasing the old ones. And Linda's love, still vivid in memory, gave him the courage to do so, to tend the garden, to laugh at spilled watering cans, to teach the children, to sit quietly by the river and let the years settle around him. He took a sip of coffee and let out a low sigh, the kind that carries both contentment and relief. Outside, the night deepened, stars glimmering in distant constellations he remembered from his childhood. Somewhere far off, a riverboat horn sounded, a reminder that life kept moving, steady and inevitable. Harold Jensen smiled, thinking that he had, at last, learned to let the currents of life carry him, to love without expectation, to remember without regret, and to find purpose in tending what could be nurtured, whether it was soil, children, or the quiet heart of a friend. The garden, the river, the memories, they were all part of the same flow. And for the first time in years, Harold felt at peace with the course of his life. Chapter 11, Harvest. Summer had settled over Prairie Falls like a familiar quilt, warm, gentle, and full of small, golden moments. The community garden was thriving. Sunflowers stood taller than most children, tomato plants sagged under their own weight, and beans climbed sturdily up their supports. Harold had begun to recognize the garden as more than dirt and seed. It was a place where life, memory, and friendship intertwined. That Saturday morning, he arrived early, carrying his thermos and a small folding stool. Margaret was already there, her granddaughter tugging at a row of sunflowers, laughing as the petals tickled her nose. "Good morning, Harold," Margaret called. Her voice was bright, carrying the warmth of someone who had grown comfortable in his rhythm, yet remained delightfully unpredictable. "Morning," he replied, smiling. "Looks like we've got a row of very determined sunflowers today." "Yes," Margaret said, nudging her granddaughter. "All yours, little miss." The girl beamed, brushing dirt from her hands. Neighbors trickled in, drawn by the sun and the promise of fresh vegetables. Mrs. Klein offered a basket of marigolds. The teenagers arrived with zucchini, and a young couple came to claim the cucumbers Harold had reserved for them last week. Harold moved among them, giving advice, sharing laughs, and helping little hands press seeds into the soil with care. At one point, he paused and watched Margaret leaning on the fence, a soft smile playing on her lips. They didn't need to speak. Presence alone said enough. He felt no yearning, no ache, only a deep appreciation for the life that had brought them both here. Memories of youth, the long shadow of unrequited love, decades of love with Linda, and the quiet joy of this shared moment. "Harold," Margaret said finally, coming closer, "I think you've created something wonderful here. It's more than a garden, it's a gathering place." He nodded, feeling the truth of her words. "It's what I hoped for, though I didn't know it at first. And the best part? It keeps growing, no matter what." Margaret laughed softly. "Like people." "Yes," Harold agreed. "Like people." As the day wore on, they harvested the first tomatoes, shared the zucchini, and handed sunflowers to children who ran off with them proudly. Laughter filled the garden, mingling with the hum of bees and the soft rustle of leaves. Harold realized that life, even with its unfulfilled loves and quiet regrets, could still offer joy, purpose, and connection. Later, as the sun sank low behind the river, Harold and Margaret walked along the garden path, their shadows stretching long across the tilled soil. "Thank you," he said softly, "for visiting, for helping, for everything." She smiled. "And thank you, Harold, for letting me be part of it." They paused by the sunflowers, standing side by side, not needing to fill the silence. In that moment, Harold felt the past settle around him, not as a weight, but as a foundation. Margaret represented gentle companionship, Linda represented enduring love, and the garden represented hope, purpose, and the joy of nurturing something living. Harold took a deep breath, the scent of soil and flowers filling his senses. He looked down the rows of plants, then up at the sky, and whispered a quiet thanks. For love remembered, love lived, and love shared in new, unexpected ways. The river flowed steadily nearby, the sunflowers swayed in unison, and Harold Jensen smiled. Life had given him plenty, and he was ready for whatever the next chapter held. And that, he thought, was enough. Epilogue. River Light. Months had passed since the first seeds were planted. The garden had grown lush and full, a patchwork of colors and scents that drew neighbors, children, and visitors alike. Harold often walked among the rows, hands clasped behind his back, letting the rhythm of life and growth soothe him. One evening, he sat on his bench by the river, the same bench that had seen decades of reflection, longing, and quiet wonder. The water shimmered in the fading light, carrying the gentle hum of the town downstream. He thought of Linda, smiling as she tended their own backyard garden years ago. He thought of Margaret, her laughter mingling with the children's voices in the community plot. And he thought of himself, older, steadier, still learning that love came in many forms, remembered, lived, shared, and sometimes quietly offered without expectation. A barge passed along the river, its horn low and steady. Harold sipped his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. Life, he realized, moved forward whether he hurried it or not, carrying joys, regrets, and small triumphs alike. He leaned back against the bench and smiled. The past had shaped him, the present sustained him, and the future, though unknown, was full of possibility. As the stars began to appear above Prairie Falls, Harold Jensen felt a deep, quiet contentment. He had loved, he had lost, he had tended life's garden. And now, in the gentle river light, he was home.